In the spring of 1945, Europe was on the brink of transformation. The world's most destructive war was drawing to its close, and the final battle would take place in the heart of the Nazi regime, Berlin. For nearly 6 years, the German capital had stood as the symbol of Adolf Hitler's power, pride, and unshakable belief in his so-called 1,000-year reach. But now, that empire was collapsing, brick by brick, as Soviet artillery thundered closer each hour. From the east came Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and guns. From the south advanced Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front, crushing every German defense line in its path. And from the west, the forces of the United States, Britain, and France were already deep inside Germany, pushing toward the Elbe River. Berlin, once the nerve center of a continent under Nazi control, was now a city trapped between two unstoppable tides. Inside the city, chaos ruled. Civilians hid in basements, shells exploded overhead, while the last remnants of the German army, old men, boys, and shattered divisions prepared for a hopeless defense. Hitler himself remained underground in his fortified bunker, refusing to accept defeat. Outside, the streets burned, and the once proud capital became a landscape of smoke, fear, and destruction. But beyond the gunfire and rubble, this was more than just a military struggle. It was the final confrontation between tyranny and resistance, between a collapsing ideology and the will of millions who had fought to end it. The Battle of Berlin was not merely the end of a war, it was the defining moment that would shape the future of Europe and the world. If you are passionate about uncovering the real stories behind history's most decisive moments, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next deep dive into the final, desperate days of World War. As the thunder of artillery echoed across the plains of eastern Germany, two immense forces bore down upon Berlin like twin storms converging on a single doomed city. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front advanced from the north and east, crossing rivers under constant fire, while Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front surged from the south, sweeping through towns and villages already reduced to ash by the retreating German army. Between them lay the ultimate prize, the German capital, the heart of a crumbling empire, and the symbol of a war that had consumed the world. By mid-April 1945, the Red Army's momentum was unstoppable. Every sunrise brought the rumble of tanks, the shriek of shells, and the march of soldiers moving westward through fields turned to mud by spring rains. The Soviet advance was relentless and methodical. They broke through the last German defensive lines along the Oder and Neisse rivers, crushing units that barely resembled organized armies. What remained of the once mighty Wehrmacht now consisted of scattered battalions of exhausted soldiers, hastily formed militia, and teenage boys clutching rifles far too heavy for their trembling hands. To the German commanders trapped inside Berlin, it was clear that their situation was hopeless. Communications were breaking down, ammunition was running out, and morale had collapsed under the realization that no miracle would come to save them. Hitler's orders to fight to the last man were still being shouted through the chaos. But few believed them anymore. Even the most loyal officers understood that Berlin's fall was inevitable. Still, the Führer demanded resistance, convinced that history would remember their defiance as heroic for the men and women on the ground. However, it was simply the end of everything they had known. As Zhukov's forces approached from the northeast, they encountered fierce resistance from the remnants of the German Ninth Army. Entire divisions were annihilated in forests and open fields as Soviet artillery blanketed the landscape with fire. Meanwhile, Konev's southern armies were advancing with equal ferocity, sweeping through the last German strongholds on the road to Berlin. Villages vanished beneath the bombardment, and bridges collapsed under the weight of Soviet armor. Every mile forward came at a terrible cost. But the Red Army pressed on, driven by vengeance, duty, and the promise of final victory. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the roar of Soviet guns could already be heard within the city. While his generals argued over strategy, Hitler emerged briefly from his underground shelter to greet a group of teenage soldiers defending the ruined streets above. Their faces were pale and hollow, their uniforms ill-fitting, their weapons outdated. Yet, to the Führer, they represented his final hope, the delusion that Berlin could still be saved through sheer willpower. As he returned to his bunker, he reportedly told his staff that the capital would stand firm. But outside, reality had already decided otherwise. Over the next 5 days, Zhukov and Konev's armies tightened their grip on Berlin from all directions. The German Ninth Army was cut off and encircled east of the city, trapped in what became known as the Halby Pocket, where tens of thousands were killed trying to break free. The few survivors who reached Berlin carried tales of unimaginable destruction, villages burning to the ground, comrades lost in the forests, columns of refugees crushed between advancing armies. For them, there was no longer any front line. Everywhere was the front. Inside Berlin, the sound of the Soviet offensive grew louder by the hour. Civilians sought shelter in subway tunnels, basements, and cellars, clutching what little food they had left. The city's skyline was a curtain of smoke and fire, its landmarks shattered beyond recognition. The Tiergarten, once a lush public park, had become a battlefield strewn with wrecked vehicles and bodies. Bridges over the Spree River were mined for demolition, while barricades made of rubble and tramcars lined the streets. Yet despite the chaos, life clung to the ruins, families huddled together in fear. Soldiers stumbled through the debris searching for orders, and the city braced for the storm that was about to consume it entirely. On April 25, 1945, the circle finally closed. Soviet forces from Zhukov's and Konev's fronts linked up at the town of Ketzin, northwest of Berlin. The German capital was completely surrounded. No reinforcements could enter. No one could escape. The encirclement was both a tactical triumph and a symbolic moment. The heart of Nazi Germany, once the center of European domination, was now an island of desperation trapped under Soviet fire. For those still inside the city, the realization struck like a physical blow. In the Führer bunker, maps covered in red arrows showed the inevitable outcome, though Hitler refused to acknowledge it. He spoke of phantom armies that no longer existed, of counterattacks that would never come. Outside, the people of Berlin no longer spoke of victory or loyalty. They spoke only of survival. Mothers whispered to their children to stay quiet as the ground shook. Soldiers scavenged for food and ammunition. Priests offered hurried prayers in the half-light of ruined churches. The once proud capital of the Reich had become a city of shadows and silence, its fate sealed by the relentless march of the Red Army. What remained was not a question of whether Berlin would fall, but how long it could endure. And as the final battle began to unfold, the world held its breath, watching the empire that had once sought to rule the earth crumble beneath its own weight. Deep beneath the burning ruins of Berlin, in a labyrinth of concrete corridors and steel doors, Adolf Hitler faced the disintegration of the world he had built. Above him, the city that once symbolized his power was collapsing under Soviet artillery fire. Yet within the Führer bunker, the dictator clung to the illusion that victory could still be snatched from the jaws of defeat. Maps littered the walls, each one marked with thick red lines that showed enemy forces pressing from every direction. The reality was undeniable, but Hitler refused to see it. Surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal followers, he issued orders that bore no connection to the chaos outside. His voice, once commanding and full of conviction, had become strained and brittle. He paced the room, pointing at phantom divisions on the map's armies that no longer existed. commanders who were either dead or cut off, units that had ceased to function weeks before. To those around him, it was clear that the leader who had once terrified nations was now trapped in a spiral of delusion and despair, yet no one dared to contradict him. To do so meant inviting a torrent of rage or, worse, being accused of betrayal. One of the last desperate orders he gave was for the so-called Steiner counterattack. General Felix Steiner, commanding a mixed formation north of Berlin, was ordered to launch an assault that would supposedly break the Soviet encirclement and relieve the capital. But Steiner's forces were shattered, exhausted remnants of divisions that had been decimated during the retreat from the Oder River. They lacked fuel, ammunition, and men. The very idea of a counterattack was fantasy. Still, Hitler insisted that it be carried out immediately. His staff obeyed the order on paper, but everyone knew it was impossible. As hours passed without news of the attack, the tension inside the bunker thickened. Officers avoided meeting Hitler's eyes. Secretaries whispered in corridors, and the thud of explosions grew ever closer. Finally, on April 22nd, word arrived Steiner had not moved. The counterattack had never begun. The last illusion of salvation vanished in an instant. Witnesses later recalled how Hitler erupted in fury, his face contorted, his words tumbling out in a torrent of rage and despair. He accused his generals of cowardice and treachery, his voice echoing through the narrow concrete chambers until exhaustion overcame him. Then, in broken tone, he admitted what he had refused to say for years. The war was lost. From that moment, the atmosphere in the bunker shifted. The leader who had demanded absolute obedience was now a man awaiting the inevitable. Outside, the Soviet artillery came ever closer, shaking the walls with every impact. The lights flickered, dust rained down from the ceiling, and the air grew thick with smoke and fear. Reports arrived that entire German armies had surrendered or been annihilated. Hitler's closest allies were either dead or fleeing. Hermann Göring had sent a telegram from Bavaria, suggesting he should take command. Heinrich Himmler was secretly negotiating with the Western Allies. Even Joseph Goebbels, ever loyal, began whispering about the end. In this twilight world of fading power, Hitler withdrew further into himself. He still held daily meetings, still spoke of imaginary reinforcements, still dictated communiques that no one outside would ever read. But his voice had lost its authority. The generals who remained no longer argued. They listened in silence, knowing that history was closing in around them. Outside the bunker, Berlin burned without pause. Entire districts had been flattened, the smell of smoke and dust filling the air. Civilians wandered the streets in search of water or shelter, while Soviet shells fell closer each hour. Inside, time became meaningless. Day and night blurred together under the dim electric bulbs. Hitler's meals were simple potatoes, soup, tea, and his once neat uniform had become wrinkled and stained. His hair, once carefully combed, now hung evenly over a pale face marked by sleeplessness. Witnesses described him as moving slowly, his hands trembling, his gaze distant. Yet even in this state, he refused to leave Berlin. Offers from his staff to organize an escape were dismissed instantly. He declared that he would remain in the capital and share its fate. For him, surrender was unthinkable. Meanwhile, the Soviet armies pressed closer, tightening the noose around the city center. Each hour brought new reports of lost positions. The Reichstag surrounded, the Brandenburg Gate under fire. The Tiergarten turned into a battlefield of wrecked tanks. Hitler continued to issue orders to non-existent corps, to commanders who could no longer be reached, to units that had ceased to function entirely. His world had shrunk to the size of the bunker. Yet in his mind, he was still commanding armies across Europe. By the final week of April, the truth was undeniable even to those most loyal to him. The German army was finished, the government powerless, and the city itself was moments from falling. Inside the bunker, Hitler gathered his remaining aides and dictated his last will and political testament. He named successors, denounced his perceived betrayers, and reaffirmed his refusal to surrender. Then, quietly, he informed those closest to him of his decision. He would not be captured alive. As he spoke, the walls shook with the continuous roar of Soviet artillery. Above ground, the Red Army had reached the city center. Soviet flags were being raised on government buildings, and street fighting raged only a few hundred meters away. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and each explosion made the bunker tremble as if the earth itself were collapsing. In those final hours, Hitler's once mighty empire existed only as a fading echo in his own mind. He retreated to his private quarters, accompanied by a few loyal aides. The sounds of destruction above ground blended with the muffled voices below. There was no triumph, no ceremony, only the quiet acceptance that the end had come. The man who had promised 1,000 years of dominance now faced the ruins of his own making. In the final days of April 1945, as the Soviet flag prepared to rise over Berlin, the dictator's delusions finally crumbled, leaving behind silence, smoke, and the haunting stillness that follows the collapse of an empire. Outside the walls of Berlin, the last remnants of the German military machine were dissolving into chaos. What had once been a vast and disciplined army now existed only as scattered fragments, retreating across the ruins of a broken nation. Command structures had collapsed, communication lines were gone, and soldiers no longer knew whom to obey. Every hour brought new reports of divisions disappearing, commanders abandoning their posts, and desperate units surrendering to the advancing Allied forces. The mighty Wehrmacht, which had once conquered most of Europe, was now reduced to pockets of men struggling to survive, in the forests and plains beyond the capital. Confusion reigned. Some officers tried to regroup their troops for a final stand, while others ordered retreats toward the west, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than fall into Soviet hands. Rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks, stories of cities already occupied, of generals negotiating in secret, of the Führer dead or missing. The chain of command that had once held the army together was gone, replaced by fear, exhaustion, and disbelief. Soldiers discarded their weapons and uniforms, blending into the columns of refugees that stretched for miles. For many, the war had already ended, even if no one had said it aloud. Inside the bunker, Hitler's world was shrinking by the minute, but beyond it, the empire he had ruled through terror and obedience was fracturing. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's oldest allies, sensed that the end was near. Stationed in Bavaria, far from the chaos of Berlin, he convinced himself that it was his duty to assume control of what remained of the government. On April 23rd, he sent a telegram to the Führer's headquarters, declaring that since Hitler was cut off and incapacitated, he would take over leadership in accordance with the succession laws previously established. To Göring, it was a practical move away to preserve order in the final hours of defeat. To Hitler, it was unforgivable betrayal. When the message reached the bunker, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Hitler, already teetering on the edge of despair, flew into a fury. His once loyal lieutenant had dared to question his authority, dared to think of taking power while the capital still burned. In rage, Hitler stripped Göring of all titles and ordered his arrest. To those inside the bunker, it was another sign that reality had fractured completely. While Soviet shells pounded the city above, the regime below was devouring itself from within. At the same time, another betrayal unfolded. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the most feared figures in the regime, was also acting in secret. As Soviet troops closed in on Berlin, Himmler sought to distance himself from the catastrophe. He began sending envoys to Sweden and Switzerland, attempting to negotiate a partial surrender with the Western Allies. His hope was to save himself and perhaps secure a role in a post-war German administration. But his efforts were doomed from the start. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender, and news of Himmler's treachery quickly reached Berlin. When Hitler learned of it, his reaction was one of cold disbelief. The man he had trusted above almost all others had turned against him. In the bunker, the circle of loyalty grew smaller still. Beyond the capital, the German army's collapse was accelerating. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of the last competent commanders left, tried to coordinate defenses in the south, but he was overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. His forces were shattered, his air support gone, and his supply lines non-existent. In the north, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz attempted to organize an evacuation of refugees and soldiers by sea, but even that operation was crumbling under Allied air attacks. Every surviving general was acting independently, making decisions not to defend Germany, but to save what little could be saved from total annihilation. The Allied advance was relentless. In the west, American and British troops crossed the Elbe River and halted only when they met Soviet forces approaching from the east. The meeting of the two armies near Torgau on April 25 symbolized the end of Nazi Germany's territory. There was nowhere left to retreat. For the soldiers trapped in the middle, surrender became the only option. Columns of German troops laid down their arms, waving white cloths or raising their hands in silence as tanks rolled past. The once proud banners of conquest were replaced by the desperate hope of survival. Inside Berlin, the isolation grew absolute. Cut off from the outside world, Hitler's bunker had become a tomb for an empire already dead. Each new message from the front confirmed what everyone knew. The armies no longer obeyed, the commanders no longer believed, and the government no longer existed. Goebbels still broadcast speeches to a nation that could no longer hear them, insisting that victory was near, but even his voice trembled with despair. Outside, the city's defenders fought on without orders, driven only by fear and the instinct to live one more day. As the circle closed around Berlin, those still within the bunker clung to the last remnants of order. Maps were studied, reports delivered, and orders issued into the void. Yet all of it had become a performance, a ritual of denial in the face of extinction. Every hour brought new signs of collapse. Radio transmissions ceased. Messages went unanswered. Command posts fell silent. The machinery of war, once so vast and terrifying, had ground to a halt. In those final days, the collapse was not just military but moral. The men who had once sworn loyalty to their leader now acted only for themselves. Some fled under cover of darkness, others disguised themselves as civilians, and a few took their own lives rather than face capture. The grand dream of domination that had consumed millions of lives ended not with defiance, but with confusion, betrayal, and silence. By the last week of April, it was clear that there was no government, no chain of command, and no future left for the Third Reich. The capital was in flames, the army scattered, and the leaders either imprisoned, dead, or in hiding. The voices that had once commanded continents were now reduced to whispers in the dark. The world outside moved on, closing in on the ruins of Berlin, while inside the bunker, the man who had demanded absolute obedience watched the remnants of his empire disintegrate around him, betrayed by those he had trusted, abandoned by those he had ruled, and engulfed by the chaos he had created. As Berlin descended into flames and ruin, the world beyond its smoking skyline moved swiftly toward the final collapse of the Axis powers. The war that had once raged across continents was drawing to a close, and while Soviet guns pounded the heart of Germany, Allied forces on every front were tearing down what remained of the fascist empires. Europe, Asia, and the Pacific were witnessing the same relentless truth. The tide had turned completely, and nothing could stop it now. In the south of Europe, Italy, once the proud ally of Nazi Germany, had become a landscape of vengeance and reckoning. After years of brutal occupation and civil war, the resistance movement that had grown in the shadows finally rose to deliver its final blow. Allied forces swept through northern Italy with unstoppable force, liberating city after city as German troops retreated in disarray. The Italian countryside, scarred by years of battles, became a stage for the last acts of a dying regime. Columns of prisoners marched along the roads, the insignia of the once feared Wehrmacht now meaningless under the banners of surrender. Amid this, one figure tried to flee the judgment that had long awaited him: Benito Mussolini. The man who had once boasted that his fascist empire would rival ancient Rome. Disguised and desperate, he attempted to escape north towards Switzerland with his mistress, hoping to evade capture by the advancing Allies and the vengeful partisans who now hunted him. But history allowed no escape. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini was captured near Lake Como by Italian partisans. The next, his execution ended the story of fascism in Italy as abruptly as it had begun. His body, along with those of his followers, was hung in Milan for all to see, a grim warning to anyone who once believed in the illusion of absolute power. As Italy was freed, other parts of the world echoed with the same message of collapse. In Asia, the Allied advance stretched across vast and unforgiving terrain. In Burma, the jungles that had swallowed countless soldiers became the setting for one of the most grueling campaigns of the war. British, Indian, and Chinese troops pushed forward against entrenched Japanese forces, enduring monsoon rains, disease, and endless combat. After months of hardship, they finally broke through the Japanese defenses, reclaiming key territories and reopening vital supply routes to China. Villages that had lived in silence for years under occupation saw the arrival of liberation forces carrying not only weapons but the hope of survival. Further east, in China, the war had taken on a character of sheer endurance. For 8 long years, the Chinese people had fought against invasion, famine, and devastation. By 1945, Japanese control was crumbling. Major cities that had once been under occupation were now under siege, and the Chinese armies, supported by American air power, pushed ever closer to reclaiming their homeland. The cost was staggering, but the determination of a nation that had suffered so deeply could not be broken. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the struggle reached a crescendo. The United States and its allies had fought a brutal campaign of island hopping, seizing one stronghold after another from the Japanese Empire. Each island represented another step toward Japan itself, another piece of territory torn from the empire that had once stretched across the Pacific Ocean. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the fighting was fierce beyond imagination. The beaches ran red with the cost of each victory. But the momentum of the Allies could no longer be stopped. The skies over the Pacific belonged to the Allies now. Fleets of bombers darkened the horizon, striking the industrial centers of Japan with relentless precision. The once mighty Imperial Navy lay shattered, and Japanese cities faced nightly bombardments that reduced entire districts to ashes. The Japanese leadership still spoke of honor and resistance, but the people knew the truth. The empire was dying, food was scarce, cities were in ruins, and the sound of air raid sirens had become part of daily life. The winds of defeat blew from every direction. Back in Europe, the Allies pressed their advantage with equal force. In the West, American and British troops met the Soviets on the banks of the Elbe River, sealing the fate of Germany. The handshake between the soldiers of two great armies symbolized not only unity but the final closing of the iron circle around the Third Reich. There was no longer any sanctuary, no safe ground left for its leaders to hide. The world that had been divided by aggression was now united in victory. For the ordinary people of Europe, this was both liberation and reckoning. Cities that had suffered under occupation were free again, but their freedom came at a terrible price. The ruins of Warsaw, Rotterdam and Vienna stood as monuments to the war's devastation. In Paris and Prague, crowds filled the streets waving flags, embracing soldiers, and mourning the countless dead. The joy of victory was tempered by the memory of what had been lost. In the background of all this triumph and destruction, the collapse of the Axis powers was not just a military defeat but a moral one. The ideologies that had promised domination through strength and purity had been exposed as engines of ruin. The leaders who had once claimed to be invincible were now fugitives or corpses, their empires nothing more than ashes. Mussolini's fall, Hitler's isolation, and Japan's crumbling defenses all told the same story: the age of totalitarian conquest was ending, and the cost of that ending would echo for generations. As April 1945 drew to its end, the fires of Berlin still burned, but they no longer represented power. They were the flames of a world being reborn from destruction, the final light of a regime that had consumed itself. Across continents and oceans, people emerged from the shadows of fear, uncertain of what the future would bring but certain that the old world was gone forever. The Allied victories in Italy, Asia, and the Pacific were not just the end of battles, they were the prelude to a new era. One built on the ruins of ambition and the fragile hope that humanity might learn from the ashes it had created. As the fires of Berlin faded into smoke and silence, the story of the Third Reich came to its inevitable conclusion, a cautionary tale written in blood, destruction, and broken ambition. What had begun as a calculated gamble for domination ended as one of the most catastrophic collapses in history. The once feared Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe with lightning speed only a few years earlier, was now reduced to disorganized remnants scattered among the ruins. Its downfall was not sudden, but the result of fatal miscalculations that had been set in motion long before the first Soviet shells struck the German capital. Germany's greatest mistake lay in its own hubris, the belief that it could fight and win a two-front war. When Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, he gambled everything on a campaign of rapid conquest. The plan depended on speed, on the mobility of armored divisions and the element of surprise. But when the blitzkrieg stalled outside Moscow, and the harsh Russian winter set in, that illusion shattered. Millions of German soldiers found themselves locked in a war of attrition that drained the empire's strength. While in the West, the Allies were gathering the power to strike back. The momentum that had once carried Germany forward now became the weight that dragged it down. As the years passed, Germany's technological advantage was erased. Its air force, once dominant, was crippled by relentless Allied bombing. The skies over Europe, once filled with the roar of German fighters, now belonged entirely to the enemy. Factories were destroyed, supply lines severed, fuel reserves depleted. Without mobility or air cover, the Wehrmacht could no longer wage the kind of war that had made it unstoppable. Soldiers were left to fight with dwindling resources, surrounded on all sides, with no hope of reinforcement. Each battle became a desperate stand rather than a campaign of conquest. But perhaps the greatest loss was not material, it was psychological. The German people, once told they were invincible, now faced starvation, fear, and the constant thunder of enemy guns. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, and entire generations lost to the front lines. The propaganda of victory could no longer hide the reality of defeat. Even the most loyal soldiers began to question the purpose of the struggle. Morale collapsed as surely as the walls of Berlin, and with it, the myth of an unbreakable nation dissolved into dust. The Allied powers understood what the German leadership refused to see. Total war demanded total endurance. While Germany exhausted itself on multiple fronts, its enemies adapted, strengthened, and unified. The United States poured its vast industrial capacity into the conflict, producing ships, tanks, and planes faster than they could be destroyed. Britain, once standing alone, became the anchor of a global alliance. The Soviet Union, though devastated by invasion, rose from the ashes with a ferocity that few had anticipated. Together, they formed a force that no ideology, no propaganda, and no army could withstand. By the time the Battle of Berlin began, the end was no longer in doubt. The Red Army's artillery barrage that shattered the German capital was only the final act of a drama that had been unfolding since Stalingrad, Kursk, and Normandy. The Wehrmacht was fighting ghosts of past victories, ghosts of a power that no longer existed. When the Soviets raised their flag over the Reichstag, it was more than a symbol of conquest. It was the moment the world exhaled, knowing that the nightmare that had consumed it for 6 long years was finally over. And yet, the ashes of Berlin carried more than defeat. They carried lessons that would shape the future. The war had shown the terrible cost of arrogance, the futility of conquest, and the resilience of those who refused to surrender to darkness. The collapse of Nazi Germany was not just the end of an empire. It was a turning point in human history. It marked the moment when the world was forced to confront the consequences of totalitarian ambition, and to rebuild a new order from the wreckage of the old. When we look back at those final days in April 1945, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what was lost: the cities reduced to rubble, the millions of lives extinguished, the dreams of a generation erased. But it is also a reminder of endurance, that even in the face of destruction, humanity finds a way to rise again. The ruins of Berlin became the soil from which new beginnings grew, a divided yet determined city that would one day symbolize both the scars of war and the strength of recovery. The story of Germany's downfall is not just the story of a failed war, it is the story of how pride, ambition, and blind faith in power can consume a nation from within. It is a story that echoes through every age, warning us of what happens when ideology replaces compassion and domination replaces understanding. Thank you for joining us in exploring this final chapter of the Second World War, a story of tragedy, courage, and consequence. If you found this journey into history insightful, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration of the moments that shaped our world. Together, we will continue uncovering the lessons of the past, because understanding history is the first step toward ensuring it never repeats itself.